A warm welcome to everyone joining us today on this webinar hosted by the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, or the IESBA. Today, we will be discussing the proposals in the Engagement Team Group Audits Exposure Draft issued on March 24, 2022, with a closing date for submission of comments of May 31st. My name is Carla Vijan. I'm a principal with IESBA. We're fortunate to have Ms. Caroline Lee and Mr. Andrew Pinkney with us today to take us through the key proposals of the exposure draft. We also have Mr. Keng Seong, who is the Senior Technical Director, with us today. Ms. Lee has been with the IESBA since January 2017 and has been the Deputy Chair of the IESBA since January 2021. She is also a member of the Engagement Team Group Audit Task Force since January 2021 and became the Chair of the Task Force as of January 2022. Ms. Lee is a partner at KPMG in Singapore, and she is also the Asia Pacific Head of Quality and Risk Management. Mr. Pinkney is an IESBA Technical Advisor and is currently a member of the Engagement Team Group Audit Task Force. He is also a director with the PwC International Limited based in London and has current responsibilities connected with independence matters for the PwC network. I would also like to give a warm welcome to our colleagues from the IESBA, or the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, Ms. Josephine Jackson and Mr. Jasper Van der Hoek, who worked on the IESA 600 revised, which is a special consideration audits of group financial statements, including the work of component auditor standard. Before I hand the floor to Ms. Lee to commence the presentation, I would like to note down a few house rules. You're more than welcome to post your questions using the Q&A function anytime during the session, and we will endeavor to answer your questions today. The slides will be distributed after the webinar, and we will post a video of the webinar subsequently, so you'll be able to access it at your convenience. Without further ado, I welcome Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Carla. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are delighted to have you with us, and we encourage all stakeholders to submit their written responses to the exposure draft. For today's webinar, I'm pleased to have Andrew co-present the webinar. Andrew has been on the Engagement Team Group Audit Task Force since its inception in 2020. So let's get started. And Diana, if you can move to the slides. Thank you. So we plan to cover 4 items in this webinar. We will start with an explanation of the background to this project. Then we'll take you through the proposals in the exposure draft, or the ED. This consists mainly of some proposed new terms and definitions and independence considerations in a group audit. Lastly, we will provide a brief update on proposed consequential and conforming amendments and timelines. On the next slide, we will go into the background. During the IESBA's consultation on its strategy and work plan 2019 to 2023, there was support for the IESBA to consider a project to address practical issues encountered by group auditors as well as component auditors in applying the International Independence Standards in the audit of group financial statements, commonly known as group audits. As part of its monitoring of the external environment for emerging issues or developments, the IESBA's Emerging Issues and Outreach Committee identified a few matters relating to the application of the International Independence Standards with respect to component auditors. These include, firstly, the implications when a parent entity is a public interest entity, or a PI, and a component is a non-PI that's audited by a non-network firm, as it was unclear whether the component auditor would need to follow the independence requirements that apply to audits of PIs or non-PIs. Secondly, the implications when a breach of independence occurs at a component audit. It was unclear what safeguards, if any, should be applied if the group auditor still intends to use the component auditor's work. The IESBA determined that it would be appropriate to explore the need for clarifications in this area, but to do so in coordination with the IEESB's project to revise ISA 600 on group audit. The next slide, we'll talk about IESBA's coordination with the IEESB. So this project came about also as a result of the IESBA initiative in coordinating with the IEESB. The definition of engagement team in the Extend Code was developed based on the engagement team definition in Extend ISA 220. While the IEESB intended to change the definition in ISA 220 for quality management purposes, the inclusion of component auditors in the revised definition raises several questions concerning compliance with the international independence standards in the context of group audits, given that the definitions of the term in the code and the ISAs are intended to be aligned. Many respondents to ED 220 requested clarification as to what engagement participants fall within or outside the definition of group engagement team and component auditor, given different evolving team structures. In light of the above, and following the coordination with the IEESB on ISA 220, the IESBA agreed to address the implications of the change in the definition of engagement team from the code's perspective to make clear the independence requirements that apply to the various individuals who are part of the engagement team under the revised definition. The IEESB, in turn, agreed to make clear in ISA 220 revised that the independence requirements applicable to members of the engagement team are specified in relevant ethical requirements, which, as defined in ISA 220 revised, include the code. A key aspect of Extend ISA 600 that intersects with the International Independence Standard is the requirement for the group engagement team to obtain an understanding of whether a component auditor understands and will comply with ethical requirements relevant to the group audit, and in particular, is independent. Some stakeholders highlighted the need to clarify the meaning of the phrase ethical requirements that are relevant to the group audit. Given that component auditors outside a firm's network who perform audit procedures for purposes of a group audit are part of the engagement team based on the revised definition in ISA 220 revised, it is necessary for the international independence standards to provide clear and consistent guidance concerning the independence of component auditors outside the group auditors network. Additionally, there is a need to go beyond independence of individuals included in the engagement team definition and consider the independence framework applicable to component auditor firms, given that ISA 600 revised establishes a requirement for the group engagement partner to take responsibility for confirming whether the component auditors understand and will comply with the relevant ethical requirements, including those related to independence that apply to the group audit engagement. In developing this exposure draft, the IESBA has engaged closely with the IESB to ensure that the proposed changes are consistent and interoperable with the ISAs, especially ISA 220 revised and ISA 600 revised. Such close coordination will continue until the completion of this project. At this point, I would like to invite Josephine Jackson from the IESBA to say a few words in relation to our coordination. Josephine, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Caroline. Of course, thank you so much for the opportunity to say a few words. But first, I would actually like to express the IESB's appreciation to the board and your staff for your support and advice when we were revising ISA 220. It's been a long process and you've been involved at all stages, and that includes, of course, any changes we made to the engagement team definition. And of course, you continued support when we were revising ISA 600, the group audit standard. So hopefully participants will be aware that the Public Interest Oversight Board actually approved ISA 600 in early April. And as shown in this slide, we have now issued the final standard and basis of conclusions. And we're now working on the implementation guide. So there'll be continued coordination with those as well. And as I say, throughout that process, both boards and staff have worked really closely together to ensure that our coordination, the coordination between us has been delivered as seamlessly as possible, in fact. And the participants may also be aware the IESBA recently finished their PI project, which is another strong example of our close coordination. And now the IESB is working out to incorporate
lost Josephine, or is it my
into the ISA literature. So we'll continue our coordination, of course, in all these projects. And now I'm looking forward to the rest of the webinar and turn back to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Josephine, and congratulations on the approval and release of ISA 600 revised.
Thank you.
And so if we then go into the first part of the proposed exposure drafts, which focuses on the proposed definitions. The first definition that we would look at is engagement teams. During our engagement with various stakeholders in developing the exposure draft, a clear message was that the IESBA definitions should align with the IEESB's definitions. And so we worked within the definitions that the IEESB had approved. The proposed engagement team definition in the IESBA code aims to confirm or develop independence requirements applicable to those individuals covered by the extended IEESB definition, considering their roles and the specific facts and circumstances. This change has huge implications on the independence of individuals now captured as engagement team members, as the extend code only deals with individuals from the firm and network firm. The revised definition of engagement team in ISA 220 revised includes, amongst others, component auditors and service providers. ISA 220 revised is only applicable to audit engagements, whereas the extend code's definition of engagement team applies to audits and other assurance engagements. Therefore, the IESBA proposed to align its definition of engagement team with the more generic definition of engagement team in ISQM 1 and include a reference to ISA 220 revised. Other ISAs were referenced to highlight the applicable standard to refer to for specific individuals, namely external experts and internal auditors, which the IEESB excluded from its definition of engagement team. During the IESBA's deliberation in developing the revised engagement team definitions, questions were raised, including by the Public Interest Oversight Board, as to whether external experts should be subject to independence requirements in audits and other assurance engagements. The IESB recognizes that given the specialized nature of external experts' work, it would not be appropriate to apply the same level of direction, supervision, and review over them as applies to engagement team members. The IESBA recognized that ISA 620 already addresses the auditor's responsibilities relating to the work of an external expert in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence, including the objectivity, competence, and capabilities of that individual. The IESBA also noted that addressing the matter of independence for external experts is outside the remit of this project. The IESBA nevertheless agreed to consider the matter as part of a future initiative. And therefore, the wording that you see in here in the first paragraph, the definition follows strictly the ISQM1 definition of engagement team. Going on to the next slide. The IESBA noted that our extant definition of the terms audit team, review team, and assurance team scopes in only engagement quality reviewers within the firm or the network. In reviewing the extant definitions of those terms, the IESBA agreed that engagement quality reviewers are individuals identified by the firm to perform engagement quality reviews, and such individuals can be sourced from within or outside the firm or its network. This is consistent with ISQM2. The IESBA believes that engagement quality reviewers whose independence plays a vital role in promoting audit quality should be subject to the same independence requirements, regardless of whether they come from within or outside the firm or its network. Similarly, the IESBA believes that individuals who recommend the compensation of or who provide direct supervisory management or other oversight of the engagement partner in connection with the performance of the audit engagement, or individuals who provide consultation regarding technical or industry-specific issues, transactions, or events for the engagement should be members of the audit team, regardless of whether they come from within or outside the firm. Similar considerations apply with respect to reviews and other assurance engagements. As such, the IESBA proposes to amend the definition of audit team, review team, and assurance team by adding the phrase or engaged by to subparagraph B of those definitions to include all such individuals. During the development of these proposed revisions, a question was raised as to whether the phrase engaged by the firm would suggest that a firm enters into direct contractual engagement with individuals outside the firm rather than the standard practice, which is for firms to be engaged by other firms instead of engaging the individuals themselves. The IESBA does not intend the code to be prescriptive in terms of the manner or type of contract, and noted that firms may in some instances contract with individuals directly. The code must, however, be clear as to which individuals are considered members of the audit team, review team, and assurance team. the change in B Roman 3 recognizes that it would not be appropriate to simply replace those who provide quality control for the engagement with those who provide quality management for the engagement. Because under ISQM 1, there may be many individuals who are involved in quality management within a firm beyond the engagement quality reviewer. Scoping in all of these individuals would be disproportionate. The IESBA has therefore focused that part of the definition on those who perform an engagement quality review or a review consistent with the objective of an engagement quality review. The concept of those who perform a review consistent with the objective of an engagement quality review is a concept that's already used in the IESBA's fee pronouncement, paragraph R410.18. So the definition on on audit team that you see on this slide is similar to proposed amendments for review team and assurance team definitions. And these are set out in the exposure draft. On the next slide, we go into the guidance in section 400 on engagement team and audit team. As a result of aligning the proposed definition of engagement team with the definition of engagement team in ISQM 1, the IESBA is proposing to make it explicit that the international independence standards apply to individuals from service providers who provide audit work on an audit engagement. The proposals refer to the definition of service provider in ISQM 1. The IESBA proposes guidance to explain that the international independence standards address explicitly service providers' independence, especially those outside a firm's network, in the context of group audits in paragraph 400.A and 400.B. In substance, this would not represent a change in practice because the extant code already defines individuals engaged by the firm or a network firm to perform audit work on the engagement to be part of the engagement team. Although an individual from a service provider would be covered by the International Independence Standard, the IESBA does not believe that the scope of the International Independence Standards should be extended to cover the individual's organization, other than in the case of a component auditor firm outside the group auditor firm's network, as Andrew will walk you through later. This is because the individual's organization does not participate in the group audit and is further removed from it. Accordingly, the IESBA considers that it would be disproportionate to bring such an individual's organization into the scope of the International Independence Standards. Next slide, please. There are different types of experts that might be used on an audit engagement, and this includes individuals with expertise in specialized areas of accounting or auditing who perform audit procedures, individuals within or engaged by the firm who have direct influence over the outcome of the audit engagement through consultation regarding technical or industry-specific issues, transactions, or events for the engagement, and individuals who are external experts in fields other than accounting or auditing. The IESBA believes that it is in the public interest to be clear whether different types of experts who might be used on an audit engagement are members of the engagement team or the audit team as defined in the code. These questions were raised during the IESBA's deliberations. Accordingly, the IESBA is proposing application material in paragraph 400C to make clear where these different types of experts stand. So in the first bullet, individuals with expertise in a specialized area of accounting or auditing who perform audit procedures are engagement team members because they perform audit procedures and their expertise is in accounting or auditing. In the second bullet, individuals who have direct influence over the outcome of the audit engagement are members of the audit team as they are consulted, but they are not engagement team members because they don't directly perform any audit procedures. In the third bullet, individuals who are external experts in fields other than accounting or auditing are neither engagement team members or audit team members because their specialization is in a field other than accounting or auditing. By the same token, the IESBA is proposing application materials in paragraph 400D to clarify that an individual performing the engagement quality review is part of the audit team, but not the engagement team. The IESBA welcomes comments on the revised definition of engagement team, the revised definition of audit team, review team, and assurance team, including the change to recognize that engagement quality reviewers may be sourced from outside a firm and its network, and the explanatory guidance in paragraphs 400A to 400D as we've just gone through. At this point, I would like to hand over to Andrew to introduce section 405 to us all. Andrew?
Thank you, Caroline. So we're now going to switch gears and talk about the independence requirements in the group audit context. So there are several aspects to this. The independence requirements that apply to individuals, and separately the independence requirements that apply to firms. So when looking at firms, the proposal addressed the group audit firm and component auditors from within the same network and those outside of the network. The proposal also addresses cases where there is a change of component auditor firm during or after the period covered by the group financial statements, and threats to the component auditor's independence may be present. And finally, there is a new section that addresses independence breaches that occur at a component auditor level firm level. Before we go into a deeper dive and to set the stage for our discussion, Caroline is going to take us through a number of definitions that have been brought over from the ISAs, as well as a number of new definitions. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. Caroline.
Thank you, Andrew. As Andrew mentioned, some of the new definitions in section 405 come directly from the ISAs, ISA 600 revised specifically. And these are highlighted in gray on this slide and the next. Others are additional defined terms to demonstrate that the independence principles apply for individuals involved in the group audit engagement as well as firms in and outside the group auditor firms network that are involved in the group audit engagement. The IESBA is proposing that, as defined, the group audit client includes not only its related entities in accordance with extant paragraph R400.20 of the code, but also any other components that are subject to audit work. This recognizes the concept of a component in ISO 600 revised, that this extends beyond a legal entity and includes a business unit, function, or business activity, or some combination thereof. And you can see that in the definition on this page. Next slide. Thank you. You can see that on the definition on this page, and it's the B definition of component audit client. As the definition of a component in ISO 600 revised is not limited to a legal entity, but also includes a business unit, function, or business activity, or some combination thereof, the IESBA is proposing greater specificity in the definition of a component audit client, depending on the nature of the component. So where the component is a legal entity, the component audit client will be the entity itself and any related entity it controls directly or indirectly. Having regard to the code's definition of a related entity, the IESBA believes it would be disproportionate to scope in any other related entities, given that these other related entities are further removed from the audit of the component. When the component is a business unit, function, or business activity, or some combination thereof, the component audit client will be the legal entity or entities to which the business unit belongs, or in which the function of business activity is being performed. The IESBA is proposing to take a proportionate approach by not scoping the related entities of such legal entity or entities in the definition. This is because in practice, control or management of the business unit, function, or business activity will rest within the legal entity or entities. The definition of audit team for the group audit is based on the definition of audit team, but adapted for a group audit. It reflects individuals performing audit procedures on the group audit, including individuals from component audit for auditor firms outside of the group auditor firms network. In developing this definition, the IESBA noted that based on the generic definition of audit team, all those within or engaged by the group auditor firm and all those within the group auditor firm's network would be scoped in if they can directly influence the outcome of the group audit. The IESBA considered whether the definition of audit team for the group audit should be extended to include individuals within a component auditor firm outside of the group auditor firm's network who can directly influence the outcome of the group audit. The IESBA observed that it would be rare in practice for such individuals to be able to directly influence the outcome of the group audit if they are not otherwise performing audit work at a component. Nevertheless, the IESBA is proposing to scope in these individuals within the definition so that they would be captured even if such a situation would be rare. So please see the highlighted subparagraph D of the proposed definition. Andrew will now walk you through the proposed independence requirements in a group audit context. Andrew, over to you, and next slide, please, Diana.
Thank you. So when it comes to individuals, the IESBA considered whether individuals from non-network component auditor firms who are performing work on the component for the audit group should be subject to the same personal independence requirements as individuals from the group audit firm and its network firms. The IESBA believes that work performed by individuals at component auditor firms is an important contributor to the group audit, whether the individuals are from the group auditor's network or not. Therefore, the proposed concept is quite simple. All individuals who are members of the audit team for the group audit are required to be independent of the group audit client. And as a reminder, the definition of the group audit client includes its related entities as specified in R400.20 of the code and any other components that are subject to audit work. We welcome your specific thoughts on this requirement for all individuals who are part of the audit team for the group audit to be subject to the same independence requirements. Now, if we turn to the next slide and deal with the requirements for firms. First, we look at the group auditor firm and its network firm. These concepts are quite similar to the principles already found in the extant code. The group auditor firm and its network need to be independent of the group audit client. However, as a reminder, in the context of a group audit, this includes other components scoped in under ISO 600 revised, even though those entities aren't considered to be related entities under the code. So now let's look at the proposal for the component auditor firm that is outside of the group auditor firm's network. If we go to the next slide. So when we think about the independence of a component auditor firm, it is important to start with the concept of the relevant ethical requirements for the group, as these are the requirements that will flow down to the component auditor firm. As we know, the IESBA code has different independence requirements for audit clients that are public interest entities or PIs, and for audit clients that are not PIs. The principle in the proposed standard is that the requirements for the group will be the requirements for the component, so that there is consistency and uniformity across the entire group. So for example, if the group is a PI, the component auditor firm will follow the independence requirements for a PI for purposes of the work performed at the component for the group audit, regardless of whether or not the component audit client is itself a PI. This is a concept that has the biggest impact on non-network firms because, as we discussed in the previous slide, the network firms are already subject to the same independence requirements as for the group audit firm itself. Similarly, if the group audit client is not a PI, the component auditor firm would follow the non-PI independence requirements for purposes of the group audit, regardless of whether the component audit client is itself a PI. So it's worth pointing out that if the component audit client is a PI, and the component auditor firm is also performing a statutory audit on that component audit client, they would need to follow the PI requirements for the statutory audit. So regardless of whether the group is a PI or a non-PI, as we will discuss next, the component auditor firm needs to apply the conceptual framework when considering other relationships or circumstances in the group. So now that we've set the same stage for the relevant ethical requirements, let's look at the proposed detailed requirements for component auditor firms outside the group auditors network. We go to the next slide. So the IESBA spent quite a bit of time assessing the requirements that would apply to a component auditor firm outside the group auditor firms network and the entities to which the independence provision should apply. We're looking for feedback in this area in general, as well as on a couple of specific points. The first key principle for a non-network component audit firm is to be independent with respect to the component audit client based on the definition that Caroline has just presented. Again, as discussed on the last slide, the independence requirements will be dictated whether the group audit client is a PI or a non-PI. Next, under the proposal, the component auditor firm is not permitted to have a direct or material indirect financial interest in the group audit client. The IESBA recognized the code currently prohibits such a financial interest in an upstream controlling entity when the audit client is material to such an entity. But given the prohibition on the group auditor firm and its networks from having such an interest, the IESBA felt a consistent approach was warranted in this case, and that the component auditor firm should also not have a prohibited financial interest in the entity on whose financial statements the group audit firm expresses an opinion. Similarly, the provisions on loans and guarantees would apply to the non-network component auditor firm with respect to this same entity. This was an area that had considerable discussion at the IESBA, and it was decided should be specifically addressed due to the financial nature of the relationships, loans and guarantees. It was also discussed whether these provisions should apply to intermediate holding companies between the group audit client and the component audit client. Ultimately, the IESBA decided to specify the provisions with respect to only the entity on whose financial statements the group auditor firm expressed an opinion, but relationships with other entities will still get addressed under the conceptual framework, as we'll discuss next. There are specific questions in the exposure draft about both financial interests and loans and guarantees involving the group audit client, and the IESBA welcomes your feedback on these two topics. Finally, the proposals require the component auditor firm to apply the conceptual framework approach in two cases. Firstly, with respect to any other relationships or circumstances involving the component auditor firm and the group audit client. And secondly, any relationships or circumstances involving the component auditor firm's network and the component audit client or the group audit client. When applying the conceptual framework, the component auditor firm would consider those relationships and circumstances that they know or have reason to believe are relevant to the evaluation of independence. So if we go to the next slide, there are two specific areas addressed in the proposal. The first one is in relation to key audit partners. So in order to highlight the relevance and linkage of the key audit partner concept to a group audit, the IESBA is proposing guidance in section 405 to explain that the group engagement partner might determine that an engagement partner who performs audit work related to a component for purposes of the group audit is a key audit partner for the group audit because of that individual's role in making key decisions and judgments on significant matters with respect to the audit of the group financial statements. It follows then that once the group engagement partner has communicated that determination to the individual will be subject to the provisions of the code that apply to key audit partners. Given that the key audit partner provisions in the code apply mostly in the context of PIEs, the IESBA is proposing that this guidance be placed within the section 405 dealing with group audit clients that are PIEs. Second aspect is non-assurance services provisions. The IESBA is proposing to make clear that where the group audit client is a PIE, the independence requirements for non-assurance services provided by a non-network component audit firm to the component audit client are those applicable for PIEs, even if the component audit client is a non-PIE. This is consistent with the overarching principle discussed earlier, that where the group audit client is a PIE, the independence provisions applicable to the audit of the component audit client are the PIE provisions. However, the IESBA felt it important to explain how the self-review threat prohibition in the revised non-assurance services provisions should be applied in circumstances where a non-network component auditor firm performs limited scope work for purposes of the group audit. For example, audit work related to a specific line item, such as inventory. In such circumstances, the reference point for the component auditor firm in evaluating the self-review threat that might be created by the firm's provision of a non-assurance services to the component audit client is the financial information on which the component auditor firm is performing audit work for purposes of the group audit. Any other financial information of the component audit client that is not relevant to the evaluation of that self-review threat, because that other financial information is not subject to audit work. We welcome comments on whether the proposed application material relating to a non-network component auditor firm's provision of non-assurance services to the component audit client, as proposed in paragraphs 405, 12A1 to A2, is sufficiently clear and appropriate. I'll now pass back to Caroline to explain more about the rationale for treating the component auditor firm a bit differently from the group auditor firm and its network. You go to the next slide.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Diana. This slide to us is important. And so we want to explain that a network is created by a larger structure of firms and other entities aimed at cooperation and that share costs or have a common profit pool, common control, ownership or management, common quality control policies and procedures, common business strategy, common brand name, or that share a significant part of professional resources. These commonalities create a close association between a firm and its network firms. As a result, R400.51 in Part 4A of the IESBA Code requires that a network firm shall be independent of the audit clients of the other firms within the network. Network firms are subject to the same independence requirements as the group auditor firm, even when they are not component auditor firms in a group audit context. Therefore, there are no new independence principles for component auditor firms in the group auditor firms network. In the case of component auditor firms outside the group auditor firms network, there are new independence requirements, but these are limited in scope in terms of entities the component auditor firms have to be independent of. A limited scope recognizes that the component auditor firm's work is limited in that it is focused on the component audit client and that work is subject to review by the group auditor firm. It's often the group auditor firm that determines the scope of work to be carried out by the component auditor firm. A proportionate approach to the independence requirements for component auditor firms outside the group auditor firm's network avoids unintended consequences of potentially limiting the choice or supply of component auditor firms for audits of component audit clients for group audit purposes. As mentioned by Andrew earlier, if a component auditor firm is engaged separately to issue an audit opinion on the financial statements of the component audit client for statutory, regulatory, or other reasons, that component auditor firm might need to comply with independence requirements different from those that would apply for purposes of the group audit. This is made clear in paragraph 405.2A2. Next slide, please. There might be circumstances in which the group auditor firm requests another firm to perform audit work as a component auditor firm during or after the period covered by the group financial statements. For example, as a result of an acquisition by the group audit client. To address these types of circumstances, the IESBA is proposing guidance based on the extant provisions of the code dealing with an entity becoming an audit client during or after the period covered by the financial statements on which a firm will express an opinion. The proposed guidance explains that a threat to the component auditor firm's independence might be created by financial or business relationships of the component auditor firm with the component audit client during or after the period covered by the group financial statements, but before the component auditor firm agrees to perform the audit work, or by previous services provided to the component audit client by the component auditor firm. Leveraging guidance in the extant code, the proposed guidance also addresses the situation where a non-assurance service was provided by the component auditor firm to the component audit client during or after the period covered by the group financial statements, but before the component auditor firm begins to perform the audit work for the purposes of the group audit. And the non-assurance service would not be permitted during the engagement period. These proposals, which are reflected in paragraphs 405.13A1 and A2, would apply whether or not the group audit client is a public interest entity. In developing the provisions addressing changes in component auditor firms, the IESBA identified a need for a conforming amendment to paragraph R400.31B of the revised non-assurance service provisions to align that subparagraph to the proposed paragraph 405.13A1B. The effect of this proposed conforming amendment is to not exclude from a firm's consideration any threats to independence created by previous services provided by the firm or a network firm to an audit client during or after the current financial statement period under audit. We welcome comments on the proposed application material relating to changes in component auditor firms during or after the period covered by the group financial statements. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. So one area that the IESBA believes needs to be clarified in the code is the process to address a breach of an independence requirement at the component auditor firm level. Under the extant code, a breach of an independence requirement by a network firm effectively is the same as a breach of the independence requirements by the firm, and therefore needs to be addressed in the same way, given the requirement for a network firm to be independent of the audit clients of other firms within the network. Therefore, if a component auditor firm within the group auditors firm's network concludes that a breach has occurred, the component auditor firm first communicates the breach immediately to the group engagement partner. The group engagement partner is required to assess a breach of independence and determine the appropriate actions to take in accordance with the extant provisions of the code dealing with breaches. Where additional guidance was required in the code is where a breach is identified at the component auditor firm level outside of the group auditor firm's network. One of the practical issues when dealing with component auditor firms outside the group audit firm's network in a group audit context is that it isn't practicable for the group auditor firm to implement the monitoring and disciplinary procedures necessary to ensure the component auditor firm's compliance with all applicable independence requirements for the group audit. This is mainly because these non-network component auditor firms are outside of the group auditor firm's control. For this reason, ISO 600 revised requires the group auditor firm to confirm the component auditor firm's understanding of and compliance with the relevant ethical requirements. So let's take a look at the process the IESBA is proposing when there is a breach at a component auditor firm. So if we go to the next slide. So there are a variety of instances which could lead to a breach of independence requirements. The IESBA doesn't believe it is in the public interest to cast doubt on the reliability of all the audit work performed in the group audit if a breach in relation to a component audit client was inadvertent and insignificant. A careful consideration of the facts and circumstances of the breach at the component auditor firm level is necessary to determine if the group auditor firm can use the work of the component auditor firm. Using the breach provisions in the extant code, the IESBA is proposing a process which would consist of several steps. Firstly, when the component auditor identifies a breach, they would be responsible for addressing the breach, evaluating its significance and its impact on the component auditor firm's objectivity and ability to perform audit work for the group audit, and determine any necessary actions to address the breach. The component auditor firm would then be required to promptly communicate the matter and its assessment to the group engagement partner. Next, it is up to the group engagement partner to evaluate the component auditor firm's assessment and impact on their objectivity. The group engagement partner might agree with the assessment or might determine further action needs to be taken to enable the group auditor firm to use the work of the component audit firm. There could be situations where the group engagement partner determines under the circumstances that they cannot use the work of the component auditor firm at all and would need to find other means to obtain the necessary audit evidence at the component. For example, the group auditor firm might determine it needs to perform the audit work at the component itself. Finally, the group engagement partner would have to communicate the breach to those charged with governance of the group audit client. When doing so, the partner would discuss the significance of the breach and whether any actions proposed or taken would address the breach and enable the group auditor firm to use the work of the component audit firm. If those charged with governance do not concur with the conclusion, the group auditor firm would not be able to use the work of the component auditor firm for purposes of the group audit. We're specifically looking for reactions for proposals for addressing breaches and welcome your comments in this area. There are a few final other matters, and I'll just hand over to Caroline to deal with these consequential and conforming amendments and the timeline going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And so, as Andrew mentioned, in the last section, we will cover proposed consequential and conforming amendments and timelines. So Diana, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the exposure draft also includes proposed consequential and conforming amendments, and these are set out in chapters 2 to 6 of the exposure draft. Chapter 2 of the ED is on proposed conforming amendments to section 360 of the code, and this is to align with ISA 600 revised terminology in relation to communication of non-compliance or suspected non-compliance with laws and regulations in the context of groups. So the definition of a component is not limited to a legal entity, but also includes, amongst others, a business unit. Chapter 3 on the proposed conforming amendments to the revised non-assurance service provisions issued in April 2021 was what I mentioned earlier when I covered changes in the component auditor firms. Chapter 4 deals with proposed conforming amendments resulting from the revision to the definition of engagement team. Chapter 5 deals with proposed quality management related consequential amendments to the code. And Chapter 6 is on proposed changes to the glossary. A few other matters were raised during the project to develop quality management related conforming amendments to the code. However, as these matters are outside the code, the scope of the engagement team group audit project, they will be considered as the IESBA develops its future strategy and work plan. So do let us know if you agree with the proposed consequential and conforming amendments. And at this point, I would like to deviate a bit and inform everyone that the IESBA has issued a strategy survey, and we would appreciate comments and inputs on the areas of focus for our strategy and work plan for 2024 to 2027. And responses or comments to that survey are appreciated before 8th of July, which is the closing date. Going on to the next slide, in terms of timeline, so we would encourage everyone to submit their comments, and comments are due by May 31st, after which there will be a high-level overview of issues presented at the June IESBA board meeting. Chances are, given the closeness of the date, that high-level overview might just be an analysis of the various responses or respondents to our exposure draft. In the September IESBA meeting, we will have a detailed discussion of issues, and the aim is to approve the final standard at the December 2022 IESBA meeting. the effective date, we'll address that in greater detail on the next slide. So as mentioned at the start of this webinar, these proposals aim to respond to questions and concerns about the application of the international independence standards in the context of group audits. The enhancements to the code resulting from this project will clarify and strengthen the international independence standards and contribute to public trust and confidence in the quality of group audits. To align the effective date of the final provisions with the effective date of ISA 600 revised, and assuming that the IESBA will approve the final pronouncements in its December meeting, the effective date of the engagement team group audit provisions will be for audits of financial statements for periods beginning on or after December 15, 2023. We appreciate any comments that you may have on this. With that, we've come to the end of the presentation segment of our webinar, and we thank you for joining us at this session. We welcome written comments on all matters addressed in the exposure draft, in particular, those matters identified during our webinar. Please include reference to specific paragraphs in your comments. Where you do not agree with a proposal, your reasons and specific suggested text would be helpful. Where you agree or are supportive, please note that in your comments. We also seek written comments from various constituents, the small and medium practitioners, regulators, developing nations, and those who translate the code to their local language. Thank you once again, and I will turn it over to Carla now for Q&A. Carla? You're on mute, Carla.
Not sure if Carla has some technical difficulty. Let me just take over then. Carla, are you there?
Yes, sorry, apologies, I'm back. Sorry, apologies. I did have
Okay.
to restart. Yeah.
So maybe, Carla, to give you some time, I will cover the first question that came through today and the answer that I posted in response to that, and then you can share with us the other questions that we had in the webinar on April 11th.
Certainly. Thank you, Caroline.
So in the first question that we received today starts by saying, in 400C, where do external experts with expertise in a specialized area of accounting or auditing fall? 400C only outlines that external experts outside of this are not engagement team members. Further, where do internal specialists or experts fall? So I guess to start it all, it would be the ISAs that you should refer to in terms of identifying the various experts. But if an individual performs audit procedures, he or she would be an engagement team member. If the individual has expertise in accounting or auditing, but they are not involved in performing audit procedures and they are consulted, then they would be an audit team member, regardless of whether that individual is in or outside the firm, given the words that we are proposing to insert, which is within or engaged by. So I hope that answer is clear. And Carla, over to you then.
Yes, thank you, Caroline, and very helpful with the answer to the question earlier. We do have a few more, but before that, as Caroline mentioned, we thought it would be helpful that we share some of the questions we received from the first webinar held Monday, April 11, just for your information. So I'll go through a couple of questions, and hopefully that might answer some of the questions you have for us today. And then we'll see how much remaining time we'll follow up with some of the questions that came through today. So if I may start, the first question is whether individuals specialize in areas such as blockchain or crypto fall within the definition of engagement team or audit team. So the task force considered this question, and we thought it's a really excellent question based on the environment we work in today. And the answer is quite straightforward. It is basically guided by the IESBA, whether they're a member of the engagement team or audit team, or neither, because we need to consider whether, first of all, if they perform audit procedures on the blockchain transaction, then they're considered to be part of the engagement team. And second tranche to that is like, if they do not perform audit procedure, but have direct influence over the outcome of the audit engagement, for example, by providing accounting and auditing consultation regarding the technical specificity of the blockchain or crypto issues, then they're part of the audit team. And lastly, if they do not perform audit procedure, do not provide accounting or auditing expertise, and instead provided direct assistance on the engagement, as experts in blockchain and crypto, for example, their work is used by the auditor to assist in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence, then they're neither part of the engagement team or audit team. And there is a specific standard that deals with auditor's expert, which is ISO 620. The second question we had was in terms of if the group audit client, it's a PI, and the group auditor firm being firm A, and the component audit client being a non-PI, the component auditor firm being firm B that is not in the same network as firm A. Would firm B be able to provide valuation services for another component, for example, say the sister company of the component audit client? So the task force considered this question, and the answer to that is the PI requirement will apply to firms B's independent vis-a-vis the component audit client, given the group audit client as a PI. Firm B will apply the conceptual framework in evaluating whether it knows or has reason to believe that the valuation services for another component is relevant to the independence from the component audit client. And we had a really good question in terms of the impact of the market structure and on CA firms with a change in definition, and if this was discussed within the task force and by the IESBA. So the deliberation undertaken by the task force IESBA, especially during the December 2021 meeting, if we consider any unintended consequences of potentially limiting the choice or supply of CA firms for audit of component audit clients for group audit purposes. So as a result, the IESBA did propose a proportionate approach to the independence requirement for component audit firms outside of the group auditors firms network. But at the same time, we would very much welcome comments from various stakeholders like yourself on the potential impact on the market structure. So we hope that you'll be able to share your thoughts and views with us when you submit your submission on the exposure draft. And we also received a question on breaches, and I'm sure this is something that will come through the questions from stakeholders today. The question relates to the process that seems to rely on component auditor firm concluding that it was in fact a breach, but what if there is judgment involved in reaching that conclusion? There doesn't seem to be currently a requirement to notify the group engagement partner of significant judgment applied in determining whether a breach occurred. So the answer to that is, we would like to point out to the various paragraph in ISA 600 revised and ISA 220 revised, which requires the engagement partner to obtain information that component auditor will comply with relevant ethical requirements, including those related to independence. There is a paragraph on application material in ISA 600, which is A144 that talks about information about breaches of relevant ethical requirements, including identified breaches of independence provision being communicated by the component auditor firm to the group engagement partner. The question whether significant judgment about breach occurring being communicated to engagement partner, it is currently not explicitly stated in the proposed exposure draft. And we say that the component auditor firm outside the group auditors firm network is required when a breach has occurred, but it doesn't specifically mention about the significant judgment. So we would love to hear from you, your thoughts about the requirement about having a significant judgment applied when a breach has occurred being communicated to group engagement partner. And lastly, there was a question about confirmation about the process around communication of breaches. The question was, for component auditor firms that are outside the group auditors firms network, if the component auditor firm reports a breach of independence to the group engagement partner, the group engagement partner should evaluate such breach and its impact, and if the group engagement partner intends to use audit evidence from the component auditor firm after evaluating the breach. The group engagement partner must also obtain concurrence from those charged with governance at corporate level, and if those charged with governance do not concur, the group engagement partner shall obtain audit evidence on the component auditor client through audit procedures other than performed by the component auditor firm. So we confirm this observation, and we'd like to draw your attention to Appendix 2 of the ED. When the group engagement partner gets all the information from the component auditor firm, the group engagement partner makes an assessment whether the component auditor firm's audit work can be used for the group audit. So assuming that the group engagement partner is comfortable with the action that's been undertaken, the next step would be for the group engagement partner to go to those charged with governance and obtain their agreement. If the group engagement partner feel they cannot use the work of the component auditor firm, then the group auditor firm will need to find another means of obtaining audit evidence. So those are the questions that we received from the webinar that we held on April 11. Now, coming back to some of the questions we have today, there is one in particular that refers to related entities. So the question is, if the group audit client includes related entities and component, does that not mean that if a related entity or component is a PI, then the group audit client is a PI? Andrew and Caroline, would one of you would like to take this question?
Sure, happy to take it first. It's an interesting question, which I think the task force did debate. Just to repeat, you know, and it won't be that uncommon that a non-PI group audit client has a PI subsidiary. Does that make the group audit client a PI? The IESBA view is that it doesn't, and that the group ethical requirements that are relevant to the audit of the group audit client continue to be the non-PIs. But as we explained earlier, clearly if the related entity component is itself a PI, then for statutory audit purposes, the component auditor will apply the PI restrictions in relation to that component audit itself. But as I said, I think it's an interesting question, and obviously if you have any comments in response to the exposure draft, they would be welcome.
If I were to add on, I would also say that there's a need to view it from the perspective of the group auditor firm and the perspective of the component auditor firm. So from the group auditor firm's perspective, what entities are caught within the definition of audit client is different from the perspective of the component auditor firm. And so in the task force trying to work through, we were looking at it from both angles, as well as Andrew mentioned, the angle of the role that an auditor might play as the statutory auditor versus as for purposes of the group audit. Hala?
Yes, thank you, Andrew, Caroline. We do have a few more. The next one is with regards to those charged with governance. Have you heard reaction from audit committees and companies on the complexity of the definition, and how have they might reacted?
So I will attempt this question. In our during the phase of our project, we did have inputs with our consultative advisory group, our CAG, and in there we do have members that represent directors or audit committees, and the message that we got was clear that we should align our definitions with the IESB's definition, because the alignment of the definitions from the two boards will reduce that complexity. And as a result, we believe, worked very hard to achieve that alignment together with the IESB. However, we do appreciate that there might be views out there that are different from the task force views, and therefore we do encourage stakeholders who are acting in the capacity as those charged with governance to provide their inputs or their feedback and comments on our exposure draft. That will help us in drafting the final pronouncements. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I hope that answered your question to the person who posed the question. And we do have one more that talks about chain of command. So the question is a person in chain of command or in consultation role included as the individual of the CA firm outside of the group auditors network? What if such a person is in a network of the CA firm?
So this speaks to the definition of audit team and audit team in a group audit. And so in the audit team definition, there isn't the consideration of individuals of the component auditor firm outside of the group auditor firm's network. In the definition of audit team for the group audit, we do have a last limb which requires that consideration, and as to whether or not there are individuals, any individual within a component auditor firm outside the group auditor firm's network who can directly influence the outcome of the group audit. So I think that is a deliberation that needs to be made by the component auditor firm, whether there's any individual that can directly influence the outcome of the group audit. And as I mentioned during the webinar, when the task force deliberated this, as well as the board, the view was that the situation would be rare unless that individual was actually involved in carrying out the audit procedures at on the component audit client. But notwithstanding that it is rare, we have put it in because there is a need to consider even those rare circumstances. So we do welcome feedback on this definition of audit team for the group audit, and in particular, the proposed change in D. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline and Andrew. I think that's the question we have that came through the Q&A today. So thank you so much to you both for the comprehensive presentation today, and also not mentioning the participants who joined us today, taking the time out to join us on the webinar. We welcome your submission to the exposure draft, and the closing submission date for it is May 31st. But in the meantime, if you do have any more questions, please feel free to reach out. and the slide deck for the webinar will be shared subsequently after this this webinar session today. So thank you, Caroline, thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone who joined us today. Very much appreciated.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.